Now we're going to return to the Chris Watts breaking news, and this is what we were discussing prior to the break. The records interview were released today, and this is the interview that Chris Watts gave to the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. Now this was done after he entered his plea, so let's listen to some further information about Chris Watts.
Details are emerging about the new confession Chris Watts gave in the murder of his pregnant wife and 2 children. In the first part of a 2-part special on Dr. Phil, a lawyer for Shanann Watts' family describes the fight that prompted Chris Watts to murder his wife.
In that fight, he essentially confessed to having an affair, that he wanted a divorce, that it was pretty much over between them. And she had said something to the effect of, well, you're not going to see the kids again. As a consequence of that conversation, he strangled her.
The attorney, Stephen Lambert, then says Shanann and Chris's 4-year-old daughter, Bella, walked into the room.
From our understanding, Bella did not witness the actual killing of her mother, Shanann. It was not until Chris was in the process of trying to dispose of Shanann's body, essentially wrapping her up in the sheet. While he was doing that, Bella walked in and asked, "What are you doing with Mommy?"
Watts initially claimed he had no involvement in his wife and kids going missing. Then he confessed to murdering Shanann, but says it was in response to her killing the children. Now it seems the full confession is coming out.
With this tape being out there, with the information on it, finally puts to bed any speculation that Chris had found Bella and Celeste dead at the hands of Shanann, and then in a fit of rage murdered Shanann, that these tapes put to rest any of that kind of speculation, and that Shanann's memory can be put to rest as a loving mother and a caring wife.
Watts was sentenced to consecutive life sentences in November. The Colorado Bureau of Investigations is expecting to publicize a written report and audio of Watts' interview on Thursday.
Just a horrible, horrible case. My background is child welfare, abuse and neglect of children. I still sit as a juvenile court judge. And let me just say this, these cases are always disgusting and always horrific. The good news is if he's coming out with details about what happened, then it can be put to rest. And the family finally has some peace knowing exactly what happened to their daughter, to their grandchildren, to their family members. On the other hand, is he being authentic? Is he credible? He has gone from a plea on TV of, I don't know what happened, I need help, look what's happened, to this confession with lots of specific details. It is a very disturbing case at best. Let me bring in my guests again because I want to talk about the fact, and Matthew, I'm going to go to you first. I'm going to talk about the fact that, hey, listen, the state determined it was appropriate to accept a plea in this case. He did receive life sentences, so he did not face the death penalty. I'd like you to assume the role of the state or the prosecution. What are the reasons that a state might decide as the prosecution, let's accept this plea and take the death penalty off the table?
Well, I think in Colorado, there's essentially a de facto moratorium on the death penalty. There's only been one person executed in the modern era of the death penalty. Former Governor Hickenlooper, who's now running for president, said he wasn't carrying out any executions. The new governor has said that he's still troubled by the death penalty. The legislature's just introduced legislation to do away with the death penalty. So, I mean, was it really an option? Life in prison or the death penalty is basically the same sentence in Colorado. So why not, get the defendant to at least, say what happened here, let the victims' families know, what happened to their loved ones. I think that's a fair exchange when really the death penalty doesn't exist for all purposes in Colorado.
All right, so Andrew, given that information, let's flip this over on its head and say, well, then why would a defense attorney say, hey, this is a plea you should consider, you can plead to this? What's the incentive for this defendant to even have entered a guilty plea in the first place versus making the state prove all the elements against him?
I think one of the things you have to remember with any sort of guilty plea is it's ultimately the choice of the defendant themselves, of the client. So I don't know in this case what the actual defense counsel would have been recommending, but I think we can see some insight into Mr. Watts's mind that he didn't want to go through this process. So the idea of a trial going on for many, many months, sitting there listening to testimony, having that come out in public about what you did and having people think about it and judge and go on and on, that might have been a very difficult thing for him to even contemplate. So his defense counsel may have recommended it for any number of reasons, financial or otherwise. He may have wanted it just to get it over with so he didn't have to sit through it.
Yeah, great point. So, Andrew, let me ask you this. Did you find what he's released as the interview that he did with CBI credible, authentic, or did you have concerns about it?
I find it to be generally credible. I mean, we're getting information from him that doesn't make him look good. It's not particularly defensive in nature. There doesn't seem to be some of that, the idea of what we call secondary gain, the reasons why people lie. That doesn't seem to be going behind it, that the wife was of this type of character, that she was a bad person, that she did something to drive him to do this. I mean, he seems to be taking relative accountability for not only the details of what he did, but the actual gruesomeness of it. So that tends to be credible. I don't know that it matters.
Let me ask you the same question, Andrew. Do you find it credible and believable, authentic, and do you think it matters?
Well, I think that it's not authentic in terms of the fact that certainly he takes responsibility for the physical acts that he committed, but he's still trying to paint them with the brush that, hey, you know, I wanted to commit suicide. You know, she wasn't making me happy anymore. You know, we had sex and it was just a trigger, and I flew off the handle. Yeah, he's physically taking responsibility for what he did, but he's minimizing in some way why he did it. That there's some remote justification for his conduct, and that's ridiculous.
And so let me ask you then, I'm going to start with you, Matt, but I want to hear from both of you on this. Is he standing to gain financially? We know that the release of the interview was an exclusive to Dr. Phil initially. And so my question is, he's in jail. Could he stand to financially gain from being on the Dr. Phil or the family and writing any books from jail? Can he financially gain from telling his story while he's behind bars?
You know, I believe that every state in the country has what's loosely defined as a Slayer's Act or, you know, Son of Sam law that says that you cannot benefit by the physical harm that you've done to somebody else. So that would include, you know, writing a book, television appearances. The state can intervene, and any money that would be derived from that, you know, would go off to the victim's families in this case. So I think there is a mechanism in Colorado that would prevent him from benefiting by these gruesome murders.
All right, let's listen to that Dr. Phil clip one more time, because this was when it was first addressed that he had given an interview and what he disclosed in that interview.
Emerging about the new confession Chris Watts gave in the murder of his pregnant wife and 2 children. In the first part of a 2-part special on Dr. Phil, a lawyer for Shanann Watts' family describes the fight that prompted Chris Watts to murder his wife.
In that fight, he essentially confessed to having an affair, that he wanted a divorce, that it was pretty much over between them. And she had said something to the effect of, well, you're not going to see the kids again. As a consequence of that conversation, he strangled her.
The attorney, Stephen Lambert, then says Shanann and Chris's 4-year-old daughter, Bella, walked into the room.
From our understanding, Bella did not witness the actual killing of her mother, Shanann. It was not until Chris was in the process of trying to dispose of Shanann's body, essentially wrapping her up in the sheet. While he was doing that, Bella walked in and asked, "What are you doing with Mommy?"
Watts initially claimed he had no involvement in his wife and kids going missing. Then he confessed to murdering Shanann, but says it was in response to her killing the children. Now it seems the full confession is coming out.
With this tape being out there with the information on it, finally puts to bed any speculation that Chris had found Bella and Celeste dead at the hands of Shanann, and then in a fit of rage murdered Shanann. that these tapes put to rest any of that kind of speculation, and that Shanann's memory can be put to rest as a loving mother and a caring wife.
Watts was sentenced to consecutive life sentences in November. The Colorado Bureau of Investigations is expecting to publicize a written report and audio of Watts' interview on Thursday.
Every time I see that clip and read, I've actually read through, Aaron Keller reported on the actual transcript that he had read. I've read it as well. It's beyond disturbing in terms of all the specific details. He even states that he thinks his 4-year-old knew the mother was dead, even though she didn't see him kill her mother. Really awful case. So, Andrew, do you think we should expect a wrongful death lawsuit from the family of the victims in this case?
There may be a wrongful death lawsuit to get every last penny that's out there. At this point, there's not a lot to squeeze out of Mr. Watts, I'm sure. Now, there is a possibility we were talking about the Slayers Act, the idea that you can't profit from the crimes that you commit, certainly not profit from it while you're sitting in jail. Now, there could be some sort of setup with Dr. Phil where there is money being routed back to the family, and he may be doing it for those purposes. That's a lot of speculation here. At the end of the day, I mean, we have a person who's not worth much. What's the process of a wrongful death lawsuit really going to get?
And so I personally have no issue at all if the family, through their attorneys, can utilize this interview that he freely gave, apparently, the defendant did, to CBI to gain financially for them as a family, as the victims' survivors. I don't have a problem with that. But let me hear from each of you. Let me start, Andrew. Do you have any issues with that?
No, I don't think that there's an issue with that. I mean, these are people who have been terribly injured by it. We don't have the person who committed the crime profiting from it. There is tremendous loss that goes along with this. The family who's still alive will suffer for the rest of their lives from the acts that were committed. So I don't find that to be a particularly distasteful thing. And in fact, when we are doing our occasional personal injury cases, we tell people as not nice as it is, money's the only thing that you can get after something like this has happened. So it's something to compensate a little.
Right. And while money's never going to make it better, I also think it gives families the opportunity financially, if there's anything that they want to try to do on a bigger basis, whether it's legislation to help victims in the future, whether it's nonprofit organizations, whatever it is, it would give them the financial ability potentially. Let me ask you the same question, Matthew. Do you have any issue with if the family of the victims, the survivors, actually financially gain from any of this?
No, not at all. I mean, I think it would be wonderful for the family if they could be compensated in some way for their loss. And I think a wrongful death action, certainly the burden of proofs are different in a civil case as compared to a criminal case. In a criminal case, we already have guilty pleas with regard to these deaths. So, proving that he's responsible for their deaths is not an issue in a civil case. It's just an issue of damages. So I certainly would go forward with that, and that may enable the family to ensure that any profits that would come from a book or other interviews would be funneled back to the victim's family.
All right. So, Chris Watts, the story never ceases to amaze me, and the details get worse and worse. Again, thoughts with the survivors of those victims in that case. We are going to take a short break, but come back on the other side as we continue to discuss and cover trials live, gavel to gavel, here on Law and Crime.